September 15, 1944. The front lines near Battlegrounds, Luxembourg. A German reconnaissance patrol is creeping through the pre-dawn darkness, scanning the road ahead. What they find stops them cold. Stretched across the countryside, barely visible in the gray morning light, is the unmistakable silhouette of an American armored division. Tanks, artillery, half-tracks, hundreds of vehicles, all bearing the markings of the 6th Armored Division, one of Patton's most feared units. The patrol commander radios back his report. The Germans begin repositioning their forces. They prepare for an assault by a division of 15,000 men. There are exactly 300 Americans in that field. The tanks are inflatable rubber. The artillery is painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The armored division is a theater set, constructed overnight by men who, 6 months earlier, had been art students in New York. They call themselves soldiers. They call what they do deception. Their enemies, if they had ever discovered the truth, would have called it something else entirely. Because if the Germans had ever realized what they were looking at, 1,100 men pretending to be 30,000, every single one of them would likely have been shot. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the most creative, most improbable, and most secretive unit in American military history. A story so classified that the men who lived it were forbidden from telling their own families for 50 years. A story that was only officially declassified in 1996. And a story that, by the best military estimates, saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. To understand why the Ghost Army existed, you need to understand a problem that haunted Allied commanders from the moment they began planning the liberation of Europe. Deception in warfare is as old as warfare itself. The Trojan Horse. Washington's crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night 1776, chosen precisely because the Hessians would never expect it. The British had elevated military deception to an art form in North Africa, Operation Bertram in 1942. Which convinced Rommel that Montgomery's attack at El Alamein would come from the south when it came from the north, is considered one of the masterpieces of strategic misdirection in modern military history. But all of these deceptions shared a fundamental limitation. They were one-time events, designed around a single operation, executed by units that had other primary missions. What the Allies needed for the liberation of Europe, a campaign that would involve constant movement, constant repositioning, constant gaps and vulnerabilities in the line, was something that had never existed before. A unit whose only mission was deception. A unit that could pick up and move on a night's notice, become a different division in a different location, and then vanish again like smoke. The idea came from 2 men who were, on the surface, completely unsuited for military planning. Major Ralph Ingersoll had been, before the war, the managing editor of The New Yorker, the publisher of Fortune magazine, and the founder of a New York newspaper called PM. The New York Times had once described him as a prodigiously energetic egotist. He was imaginative, mercurial, and constitutionally incapable of following conventional thinking. He had served in North Africa, watched the British deception operations up close, and come home convinced that the Americans were missing something fundamental. His partner was Colonel Billy Harris, the exact opposite. Methodical, precise, a professional soldier who understood logistics and organization. Where Ingersoll was the dreamer, Harris was the engineer. Together, in the second half of 1943, working out of a planning office in London, they designed something that had no precedent in American military history. A full tactical deception unit, mobile, self-contained, capable of simulating 2 entire divisions, approximately 30,000 men, using sound, visual illusion, and radio trickery. A traveling road show with the German army as its audience. They sold the idea to the top brass in late 1943. On January 20, 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Then came the question of who to put in it. The Army's solution to the personnel problem was one of the stranger recruitment decisions of the entire war. Visual deception. Making fake tanks look like real ones, making empty fields look like staging areas, making 300 men look like 15,000, was fundamentally an artistic problem. It required people who understood how things looked from a distance, who understood light and shadow and the geometry of camouflage, who could look at a rubber balloon and figure out how to make it cast the right shadow at 3,000 feet from a German reconnaissance aircraft. The Army went to the art schools. Notices appeared at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, at Cooper Union in Manhattan, at art colleges in Philadelphia and Cleveland and Boston, vaguely worded, nonspecific, seeking recruits for a camouflage unit that would draw on artistic skills. The average IQ of the men recruited into the visual deception unit was 119, among the highest of any Army unit in the European theater. The roster of the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion reads, in retrospect, like a peculiar preview of the post-war American art world. Bill Blass, a 21-year-old fashion student from Fort Wayne, Indiana, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated designers in American history, a name synonymous with American elegance for 4 decades. Ellsworth Kelly, a young painter from Newburgh, New York, who had heard about the unit while still at art school and actively sought it out, and who would become one of the defining abstract artists of the 20th century, his canvases hanging in every major museum in the world. Art Kane, who would go on to take the iconic 1958 photograph A Great Day in Harlem, assembling 57 jazz musicians on a Harlem stoop for a portrait that remains one of the most famous images in the history of American photography. Arthur Singer, who would produce the landmark Birds of North America illustration series. None of them, on the day they enlisted, knew exactly what they were getting into. None of them knew the unit would operate within rifle range of German lines. None of them knew their unit's existence was so sensitive that if captured, they might simply be shot. 19-year-old Bernie Bluestein from Cleveland spotted the notice on his art school bulletin board in March 1943 and signed up. Decades later, he said, "If I had known that before I got into the service, I probably would have made a different decision." But sound deception required different skills entirely. The 3132nd Signal Service Company Special was built around a piece of technology so advanced it barely existed yet, high-fidelity wire recorders, the direct predecessor of the tape recorder, connected to enormous speakers mounted on half-tracks. Engineers from Bell Laboratories worked with the unit to record the sounds of armored divisions moving, tank engines, track noise, orders being shouted, equipment being loaded. The recordings were made at Fort Knox, Kentucky, with real tanks and real infantry units. They were then pressed onto records that could be mixed in the field to create any sonic scenario the mission required. The speakers were the size of large refrigerators, powered by amplifiers that produced 500 watts of sound. On a still night, the sound of an armored division could be heard 15 miles away. The radio deception unit handled communications. Germany's intelligence services depended heavily on intercepting and analyzing Allied radio traffic, the patterns of transmission, the call signs, the characteristic fists of individual operators. Every real American division had a radio signature that German signals intelligence had been studying for months. To replace a real division, the Ghost Army's radio operators had to perfectly replicate not just the content but the style of that division's transmissions. This required listening for weeks to the real unit's operators, studying their individual habits, memorizing their patterns. It was, in a sense, identity theft conducted in Morse code. There was a fourth element that perhaps best captured what made the Ghost Army unlike anything that had come before: impersonation. In the field, Ghost Army soldiers would sew the shoulder patches of whatever division they were simulating onto their uniforms. They would drive through local villages in jeeps marked with the simulated unit's insignia. They would walk into local bars and cafes, knowing that German intelligence had informants in every civilian population, and loudly discuss, in English, the movements and plans of their fictional division. They were actors performing for an audience they could not see, in a theater where a bad performance could get them killed. The 23rd arrived in England in May 1944, 3 weeks before D-Day, and immediately participated in Operation Fortitude, the massive Allied deception designed to convince Germany that the Normandy landings were a feint, and that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. They created phantom divisions, generated false radio traffic, inflated dummy equipment near the Dover coast to reinforce the illusion of a massive force preparing to cross the Channel at its narrowest point. It worked. Hitler held his panzer reserves back from Normandy for weeks, waiting for the real invasion that never came. The Ghost Army was a small piece of a larger deception, but they had passed their first test. Their first fully independent operation in France was less impressive. Operation Elephant, in early July 1944, was designed to cover the movement of the 2nd Armored Division, to sit in the space the division had vacated and convince German observers that it was still there. The operation, by the unit's own later assessment, did little good. The Ghost Army was still learning its craft, but they were learning fast, and the operations became progressively more sophisticated, more dangerous, and more effective. In August 1944, as American forces besieged the French port of Brest, the Ghost Army was sent to fill a gap in the encircling line, to convince the German garrison inside the city that they were surrounded by far more force than was actually present. They inflated their rubber tanks. They ran their sound trucks. They sent their radio operators into the net. The Germans inside Brest, according to post-war intelligence assessments, significantly overestimated the size of the encircling force. September 1944 brought Operation Battlegrounds, the operation near Luxembourg where that German patrol had found a field full of rubber tanks in the pre-dawn darkness. The Ghost Army filled a hole in Patton's line for an entire week, 300 men pretending to be a division, while the real units repositioned. The Germans never attacked. Whether they were deceived or simply cautious, the gap closed before it was exploited. But with success came danger. The Ghost Army operated, in the unit's own official history's words, dangerously close to the front lines. They were armed with nothing heavier than .50 caliber machine guns, no artillery, no armor, no capacity to withstand a serious assault. If a German unit ever probed the deception with real force, the men behind the rubber tanks had no realistic option except to run, and hope the real units arrived in time. Their most costly operation came in November 1944, when they were ordered to simulate the 80th Infantry Division during fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. 2 men were killed, 15 were wounded. The casualties were real. The division they were pretending to be was not. Through the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, the 23rd continued operating, generating false signals, creating phantom units, contributing to the fog of confusion that the German offensive depended on cutting through. And then, in March 1945 came the operation that the unit's official history would describe, with rare understatement, as fortunately its best. Operation Viersen. March 18th to 24th, 1945. The Rhine River was the last great natural barrier protecting the German homeland. The Allies had been fighting toward it for months. Its crossing would open the road to the heart of Germany, to Berlin, to the end of the war in Europe. The Germans knew it was coming. They had fortified the eastern bank, positioned their remaining forces, and prepared to contest the crossing with everything they had left. The United States Ninth Army planned to cross at a specific point in the north. The Ghost Army's mission convinced the Germans that the crossing would happen 10 miles to the south, at the town of Viersen. They had 1 week and 1,100 men to simulate 2 entire infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, totaling approximately 40,000 soldiers. What followed was the Ghost Army's masterpiece, its magnum opus, the most elaborate military deception conducted by a tactical unit in the entire European theater. 600 inflatable vehicles were positioned across the countryside south of the real crossing point. Rubber tanks, rubber artillery pieces, rubber half-tracks. Fake command posts were established, staffed by Ghost Army officers wearing the insignia and shoulder patches of the 30th and 79th Divisions. Real vehicles had their markings changed overnight. Road signs were altered. The sonic trucks ran their recordings continuously. The sounds of 2 divisions assembling, moving, preparing to cross, engine noise, shouted commands, the clank and grind of tank treads, the distinctive thump of pontoon sections being lowered into water. The radio operators ran 2 complete false communications nets, replicating the exact transmission patterns, call signs, and individual operator styles of both divisions. German signals intelligence, monitoring the traffic, would have heard exactly what it expected to hear. 2 American divisions, 40,000 men, preparing to cross the Rhine at Viersen, and Ghost Army soldiers, wearing stolen insignia, drove into local towns and talked loudly in bars about the crossing to come. The operation hit its target with a precision that, in retrospect, seems almost too complete to be real. A genuine American reconnaissance aircraft, navigating in poor visibility, mistook the Ghost Army's fake airfield for the real one and landed on it. The Germans shelled the 23 Arties positions. The only casualties were inflatable vehicles punctured by shrapnel, which were repaired before dawn. On March 24, 1945, the United States Ninth Army crossed the Rhine River 10 miles north of where the Germans were waiting. They crossed against almost no opposition. The eastern bank was virtually undefended. General William Simpson, commanding the Ninth Army, later said that he believed the Ghost Army's deception had saved 10,000 American lives in that single operation. It was the Ghost Army's last performance. The war in Europe ended 7 weeks later. On September 15, 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially deactivated. The soldiers were told, before they left service, that what they had done was a secret. Not just classified, a secret. They were not to discuss it with their families. They were not to mention it to friends. They were not to write about it, speak about it, or acknowledge it existed. The reason, as far as anyone could determine, was that the military wanted to preserve the option of using a similar unit in a future conflict. Specifically, the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. If the Ghost Army's methods became public knowledge, any potential enemy would be looking for them, and so the men went home and were silent. Bill Blass went back to New York and built a fashion empire. He became one of the most famous designers in America, a fixture at society galas, a man whose name appeared in glossy magazines for decades. He almost never mentioned the war. When he did, he spoke only in generalities. The specific truth, that he had spent a year and a half near the front lines of a world war, building fake armies from rubber and paint and sound, remained unspoken. Ellsworth Kelly returned to his painting. His wartime experience with camouflage, the study of how shapes and colors deceive the eye, how perception can be manipulated by the careful arrangement of visual information, quietly influenced the abstract work he would spend the rest of his life creating. He died in 2015, one of the most significant artists of the 20th century, and a man who had spent years of his youth helping to fool the Wehrmacht. Art Kane photographed the jazz world, produced some of the defining images of American music, and kept the secret. Most Ghost Army veterans were not famous. They returned to Cleveland and Brooklyn and small towns across America, became teachers and engineers and commercial artists and fathers, and raised families who had no idea what they had done. For 50 years, their service records described assignments that made no particular sense. The unit they had served in had, officially, done nothing remarkable. In 1985, Smithsonian Magazine published the first public account of the Ghost Army, based on a tip and some research. It created a small stir, and then faded. The story was out there, but without official declassification, it remained difficult to fully document. In 1996, the records were officially declassified. By then, many of the men were in their 70s. Some had already died. The ones who remained alive could finally, for the first time, tell their children what they had done in the war. There is a classified Army report, written 30 years after the war and released with the declassification in the 1990s, that contains one of the more remarkable sentences in the official history of American military operations. It reads, "Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. The numbers are, at this point, well established. 22 major deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. 3 men killed, approximately 30 wounded, between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives saved, by military estimate. Operation Fearsome alone, according to the commander it protected, may have saved 10,000. But there is something in the Ghost Army's story that goes beyond the arithmetic of lives saved and operations executed. Something that has, perhaps, kept it more obscure than it deserves to be. War stories, in the American tradition, have a specific grammar. They are stories of courage under fire, of men enduring physical hardship, of sacrifice measured in blood. The Ghost Army does not fit that grammar. Its men were not primarily warriors. They were artists and designers and radio operators and engineers. Their weapons were imagination and craft. Their victories were invisible. A German unit that didn't attack, a crossing that wasn't contested, a gap in the line that remained undiscovered. You cannot take a photograph of a deception that worked. There is no dramatic moment, no flag raised over captured territory, no image that captures what it looks like when an enemy decides not to attack a position he believes is heavily defended. The Ghost Army's greatest achievements are defined precisely by what did not happen, and so they were forgotten, or rather, they were never properly remembered in the first place. In February 2022, 77 years after the war ended, the surviving veterans of the Ghost Army, most of them in their 90s, a handful still alive, received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. President Biden signed the bill. There were ceremonies and speeches and photographs. The men in those photographs had spent most of their lives unable to say what they had done to deserve the honor. But the story they carried, the story of 1,100 artists and engineers and radio operators who bluffed the German army across half of Europe, who built a fake world in rubber and sound and radio noise and sheer audacity. That story is, in its own way, one of the stranger and more extraordinary things that human beings did to each other in that long and terrible war. They fooled everyone. They saved thousands of lives. They came home and said nothing. For 50 years, the Ghost Army was a secret that only ghosts could tell. The fields near Battlegrounds, Luxembourg are quiet now. The roads where Ghost Army half-tracks once rumbled, blasting the recorded sounds of armored divisions into the night air, carry ordinary traffic. There is no marker, no monument, no indication that anything unusual happened here in the autumn of 1944. Somewhere in the history of those fields, a German patrol reported an American armored division that was not there. And somewhere in the arithmetic of that report, decisions were made, forces were repositioned, an attack was not launched, and men who will never know they were protected went home to their families. The Ghost Army left no trace. That was the point. But they were there. And for one night in September 1944, with rubber tanks and painted canvas and the recorded sound of engines that were not running, 300 men held a line that 15,000 men were supposed to hold. And it worked. If this story surprised you, if you had never heard of the Ghost Army before today, then subscribe. Because history is full of stories that nobody bothered to tell. We're just getting started.